Welcome back to Neuroconvergent Leadership, where we talk about effective communication in a neurodiverse world. I'm Jeremy Doran. I help great engineers and STEM professionals become great leaders. Are you a person who tends towards introversion like I am? Has it ever been a challenge for you to be successful in business because of that? We're going to dive into that because today we have a fantastic guest. It is Stacey Chazin. And Stacey, welcome.
Thank you, Jeremy. I'm happy to be here.
We're excited to have you. Stacey, can you just spend a minute or two explaining to the audience what it is that you do?
I would be happy to. So the first thing I have to say is I am a proud introvert, and I love the arms raised in the air. It's a wonderful thing, and it's wonderful to feel proud about that, to feel great about it. I work as a leadership coach, guiding other introverted professionals to identify what their core strengths are, what we call their positive core, the best of who they are as an individual, as a professional, and to use those gifts and talents to be more successful in their jobs, become a more recognized and prolific leader, and really feel more fulfilled in all aspects of their professional life.
I love it. I do a talk on finding your true strengths, and very often it's what people view initially as a weakness or a challenge that is really the thing that can help you be the most successful. So I'm so happy to hear that you focus on that as well. When you say that you focus on people who tend towards introversion, are there any particular verticals or industries that you tend to work in?
Another arm of my business is I am a health policy and public health consultant. So I have a lot of relationships with people in that space. I am well known there and in the sector and in niche of that world. Actually, this is a great question, because when I started when I started along my path to become a leadership coach for introverts, I was working only in that world, in health policy and public health. And I started to have some experiences with leadership development for people in that space. So in a previous job, I had the opportunity to create a leadership academy for folks who are state health leaders. So they work with a state Medicaid agency or a state Department of Health and help them figure out how can they, do what I described earlier. How can they tap into the best of who they are to become more effective leaders? And I saw such resonance with folks, and they weren't just introverts. They were people, introverts, extroverts, across that whole spectrum. And I started to really see that resonate, and I saw it especially resonate over time with the introverted people, because what I've learned is that almost every workplace is really geared for extroverts. There are some exceptions, but most workplaces are very extrovert friendly. So there's open workspaces, you have back-to-back meetings with no time to recharge, which is really tough on introverts. There are demands for collaboration and networking, lots of things that are not naturally our sweet spot as introverts. Although what I coach my clients to know is you can do all these things, you just need to do it the introvert way, not try to pretend to be an extrovert, right? So all of this is to say, when I first started coaching, a lot of the folks I was speaking with were from that world, because that's where my relationships were. But then over time, it's really morphed. I'm getting a lot more interest from people who are working in fields that are great landing spaces for introverts, fields where people can show that they go deep with their subject matter expertise, where they have time to work on projects. It's not an on-the-fly, come up with a brilliant creative idea right on the spot, but you have time to go deep. You have the opportunity to work in smaller groups or with just one other person or even by yourself. So these are all the types of tasks that align with typical introvert energy styles and introvert skill sets. And I see a lot, not surprisingly, a lot of folks are in the STEM space.
So it kind of makes sense, because people in the STEM fields tend to need to do a lot of deep thinking, and us people who tend towards introversion love being in our own brains and just letting the thoughts process. So that makes a lot of sense. And when you are talking to these people, are you finding that introversion is an asset to them? Is it a challenge, or is it both?
Well, it's It's both. The challenge is, I think, seeing their introversion as assets. I think that society has told us over and over again that the ideal is to be extroverted, and I realized when I was thinking about my journey to embracing my own introversion, I realized that really starting in preschool, we get those messages. If you think about it, teachers will say, "Oh, and as a parent, I heard this too. You want your kid to sit for circle time, have more friends, play with the kids on the playground, right? And having more friends, engaging more, is really valued over having deeper relationships with fewer people." And we see the same thing in elementary school, in high school, right? How big is your social group? And then you see it when you start your career as well, that there's this emphasis on how many new contacts can you make? How can you build your network? How can you be more of a team player? And all these things are important to do, but the way that an introvert is going to do them well is going to be very different than how an extrovert does it. But we don't hear that. Right? We hear, "Oh, you went to a conference. How many new business cards did you collect?" Or, I guess, bringing that into the 2020s, I know, how many people did you add to your LinkedIn?
How many QR codes did you get?
Exactly. Right. So it's flipping the script for them to show, like, even though you've been hearing these messages your whole life, the fact that you're an introvert and the fact that you're wired a certain way or have preferences aligned with introversion, these are great things. You just need to learn how to use them and not try to pretend to be an extrovert. Think that you're going to be more successful. Let's say if you add 50 new contacts to LinkedIn, but you're going to be more successful perhaps and more likely if you go to a conference and you make 3 new connections who you get the opportunity to go deep with.
Right.
And form a more meaningful relationship. And you're going to feel a whole lot better about it. You're not going to feel drained. It's going to feel more authentic to you. It's going to give you that opportunity to go deep, even in a cocktail party conversation. So that's what it's about.
Yeah, I agree with you. The message starts early. Even to some of your grades are based on class participation in school, and
Yes.
some of your performance review is based on, are you a team player? So
Yes.
But, as you mentioned, we may tend towards introversion. It doesn't mean we can't do the other things.
That's right.
We talked about networking, and
Yeah.
I've been to networking events, and sometimes I'll laugh at myself because I only talked to 2 people, but we talked about some really, really deep stuff, and it was great.
Yeah.
And then some other times I just kind of skim the surface and try to get out of there. What are some strategies that you give to people who need to lean outside of their comfort zone somewhat?
Yeah. And I will say this is a being effective and comfortable at conferences and as a network was what got me started. When I started blogging about that. I wrote a blog before this very large conference I went to a couple years ago, right after COVID, when in-person conferences started coming back. And I reflected on when I went there, how I was reminded about how much I hated conferences, right? Like for introverts, one silver lining of COVID, as awful as it was that we did get to be in our own space a little more. So post-COVID, we're back out in the world, and I started experimenting with some things that worked for me and observed what worked for some other people. And here's what I can offer that I think really works, and I've heard from my clients and other people who read my blogs have shared. So the first thing is you want to prepare for a conference. So a lot of conferences these days, there will be an app, a conference platform that you can use. And in most cases, you can ahead of time see who's going to be there. You can take a look at the list. And what I recommend is identifying a handful of people on that list who you want to make sure you meet. Or people that you may have met before who you want to get to know better and build on a relationship with. So depending on how long the conference is, maybe it's 3 people a day, whatever feels right for you. And then you make a list for yourself ahead of time. You say, this is the list of, let's say, 6 people I want to meet at this, or I want to connect with at this 3-day conference. So you're setting that goal to begin with. The next thing that introverts are really good at is preparation. So take a look at those 6 people and say, and read up about them, right? Where do they work? What's their role? What is it that you want to get from the conversation? It could be, you want to get an idea. You want to get advice from them. Maybe it is that you want to find out about job opportunities with their organization. But be specific about what you want to get out of each conversation, about each engagement, and then prepare for it. Get the information you need so you know what this person's perspectives are, what their experiences are, so that you're showing them that you're prepared, which reflects really well on you. And it also alleviates some of that stress of having to come up in the moment with things to talk about. When I talk about characteristics of introverts, these characteristics are not going to apply to every person who's introverted, and it's not going to apply it at all times, right? So these are tendencies that introverts have. And more often than not, if you're an introvert, you're going to have these tendencies, but they're also going to show up differently in different situations. So I want to put that out there. That said, another characteristic that many introverts have, myself included, is perfectionism. And we put off doing something because we feel like it's not quite right yet. It's not ready. And I think that's tied to the fact that we do tend to go deep in subject matter expertise, and so we feel like we need to be putting that on display. And are we putting it on display in the absolute optimal way we can? So that's one thing that happens. So I would say if you're putting off doing something because you keep researching or you keep rewriting a draft, stop yourself and give yourself a deadline. Say, I'm going to do everything I can by 12 o'clock tomorrow, and wherever I am is going to be good enough, and I'm going to make that call. I'm going to do that outreach. And the same is true if you're at a conference, right? I would encourage you, don't feel like, oh, I don't think I know that person quite well enough. Whatever you've done to prepare for it, for the conversation, don't make perfection the enemy of the good.
I like to use the phrase, if something's worth doing, it's worth doing poorly. And people hear that and they're shocked. They're like, what do you mean do it poorly? I'm like, it's never going to be perfect. And if you wait too long, then you're just never going to do it. And then someone added, which I thought was great. He said, how about if we make it, if something's worth doing, it's worth doing poorly at first. And then we'll get better and better at it. That's how Microsoft made however many billions of dollars. They would release things before they were quite perfect, knowing that people were going to help them and that they were going to improve it and it would get there. But it got things out fast enough that they could just dominate the market.
I love that. And if I might, and I'll give you a link for the show notes if I can, but I have because we're talking about conferences, I have a conference survival guide for introverts that I've created. It's a free tool. People can go to ifactorgift.com. So my business is iFactor Leadership. And it's about some of the things I already talked about, but other ways that you can also protect your energy at conferences, right? How can you, at the end of the day, we've all felt if you've gone to a big conference, you just want to crawl into bed at the end of a long day, which is fine. One of my pieces of advice is don't feel like you need to go out to the bar in the hotel afterward or go out to dinner with other people. If you're spent, if your energy is tapped, no good is going to come of doing that.
I like it. Another interesting thing is that for me, speaking in public is fun. So I actually like it. And it turns out that about 2/3 of all public speakers are actually introverts. And for me, it's partly because that's not really interacting with people. It's kind of doing a performance. And sometimes when I'm networking, if I'm going up and talking to someone and I have a story to tell that's appropriate, then that is switching it over from the potentially stressful interaction and turning that portion of it into a performance, which I am comfortable doing.
I love that. And you are the first podcast host who's ever come at that topic that way. I can't tell you how many times I've been asked, how come introverts don't like to present in front of large groups? And I love to debunk that myth for the exact reasons you said. Right? You're up there. You have time to prepare. You're not doing it on the fly. You're able to do your research ahead of time, pull together data, stories to incorporate. You don't have to make small talk, right? Because you're up there in front of the room. There might be questions at the end, but no one's asking you to make informal chit chat.
Right.
And And that point too, and we tend to be natural storytellers, in part because we're prolific readers, many of us. So we're very good at crafting and telling narratives. So I love that you recognize that. I love to present as well. I'd much rather be up on the stage doing a presentation than mingling in a room with less structure and the need to just come up with chit chat.
The struggle for me is I know that before I present, I should interact with the audience so that I can get a feel for it. But that part is work for me. So I try to do it before getting to the actual event and maybe just polling people, because having to sit there and chit chat with people for half an hour and then go up on the stage has used up a fair amount of my energy already. So I try to separate the two tasks.
Yeah, that's smart.
What are some of the strengths that you help people to lean into due to their introversion or any other things?
First and foremost, because I feel like this is very heart-based, which a lot of introverts, so many introverts think they're not good at this, is relationships with other people, forging deep, meaningful, not personal, but individual relationships with people at work. So someone will say, "Oh, I'm not a people person," and they also think that means they can't be a leader, which I can get to in a bit. But I try to reinforce for them that as an introvert, you're very good at going deep. Introverts also tend to be highly empathetic. And so I encourage them, I guide them to tap into those two gifts and say, again, don't try to make 10 new connections, but identify a few people in your workplace who are people who it's important for you to work with, or people outside of your organization who are thought leaders who you want to connect with, and try to go deep. Figure out how we talk through a plan of how they can use that strength, use their empathy to create relationships with people that are going to be meaningful to their career. So that's the first one. Another thing that introverts are very good at, many of us, is writing. And so I try to encourage, if an introverted coachee of mine has a flair for writing, I work with them to say, how can you use your writing to establish your thought leadership and shine a spotlight on all the great things, all the contributions you're making at your organization, so that you can be recognized for the leader who you are. And that could be, it could be blogging, starting your own blog. It could be contributing to other people's blogs. It could be being purposeful about writing a summary of things you've done over the course of a month that you share with your manager, or offer observations on some trend in your industry with colleagues. So to tap into that, I say the power of the pen, even though it's, the power of the keyboard in all likelihood, but to do that, I think, is really important.
I like the power of the keyboard. I still refer to books on tape. So these and the younger people don't even know what I'm talking about anymore. But
right,
those stay with us.
Yeah. The other thing that introverts are really good at, that I guide them to leverage, is we're actually really good communicators. We just do it in a different way. For us to be powerful communicators, we tap into a different set of gifts than extroverts typically do. And when I say that, one, I say it's writing, to use your writing to communicate. But we also tend to be very good at reading between the lines, so to speak. So picking up on nonverbal cues, body language, facial expressions. And this is both especially important and at the same time more challenging in our virtual world. So a lot of the times because it's so important for introverts, we tend to be really good at it. However, you miss out on a lot of those nonverbal cues when you're on a virtual platform. It's just, someone is in a 1x1 or a 2x2 inch box on your screen. Yep. And so it's a little more difficult in that space, but to pay attention to, if you're on Zoom, let's say, if someone is leaning in, it's going to show that they're more engaged. If someone is sitting back and maybe crossing their arms, there's some defensiveness, or they're not agreeing with what you say. So it's how can you tap into that? And how can you, for introverts, when we talk about communicating at meetings, let's say, which is a really important space for most people and most companies, you have meetings that are on Zoom or you have meetings in person. How can you have your voice heard, your ideas recognized in meetings as an introvert. Because extroverts, we say, tend to think out loud, and they like to take up a lot of airspace. So there could be a problem or a question posed, and the extroverts are likely going to be the first ones to speak up. Because unlike introverts, they want to talk through what they're thinking, whereas the introverts are going to sit back and recognize that they need to process that a little longer. So I guide my clients to think about how can you prepare for and show up at a meeting in ways that are going to let you claim the airspace that you need. And it's not going to be about speaking as often or as loudly or as spontaneously as your extroverted colleagues, but it's about requesting the meeting agenda in advance and identifying one key point you want to make about each item that's relevant to you, jotting it down and having that handy, and doing any research you need to do ahead of time to support those points, so you're not having to think on the fly as much. So that's one way to do it.
So I'm going to tie a couple of different thoughts together. You talked about how important empathy is, and I agree. And part of that is asking questions. And I think most introverts are very good at asking questions and deeper level questions. So I'll ask a question and then I'll ask the next question about what's behind that. And the reason why I started doing that is because that way I can participate in a conversation without actually having to talk. I would ask questions and I would get them going, and I would be directing the conversation, but I wouldn't have to do all the talking. And in a meeting, like in a business meeting, sometimes the only thing that I will have done was asked one or two questions, but they were good enough questions that at the end, everyone unanimously agreed that I was the person who knew the most in that meeting. I'm like, I never said anything. I just asked a question. They're like, but they were really good questions. So being able to ask good questions goes a long way towards showing what you know. Interestingly, it seems the opposite, but it shows how much you know when you ask the right question. And it's a great way to not have to be the one talking all the time.
Yeah, I think that's brilliant. And it also speaks to, I think that when we speak up less frequently as introverts, when we do speak, it's noticed.
And do you ever coach the people who are running those meetings how to run the meeting when you have both introverts and extroverts in the room? What are some strategies you can do as the person running the meeting so that the airtime is balanced?
Great question. I actually wrote something about this a couple years ago about managing power dynamics in meetings. And it wasn't specific to introverts. It was really about leveling the playing field. Actually, when I wrote it, it was more through a demographic lens. So whether it's based on gender, race, ethnicity, other positions of power, how do you manage a conversation in a meeting so that you make sure there's equal space? And there's some ways to do that kind of prioritize people who are from traditionally minoritized or other groups to give them airspace. What's interesting about this question, though, is the introverts don't necessarily want the same airtime, right? So if I'm just gonna, as an exaggeration, if a meeting facilitator were to say, okay, Joe extrovert, you've already given us 5 ideas. Now Jane introvert, you give me your 5 ideas. She's probably not going to want to do that.
Nope.
She might want to just give you 1. So I think what it's about is making sure that people have the space and the comfort level to contribute in the way that they want to. And for introverts, what that might mean and likely will mean is they might want to have an opportunity after the meeting to give their ideas in writing, or meeting with the facilitator or the meeting lead in a one-on-one or a smaller group. Right? It's going to be creating ways that people can contribute that are aligned with when you're going to get the best out of them and when they're going to feel the best about doing it.
2 strategies that I often recommend is, 1, making sure the ground rules are very clear up front. And if you say each person who has something to say only gets 1 minute or whatever the time frame is, then you have the right to cut someone who's talking too long off. And if you set it up, say, I'm going to want to hear 1 idea from everyone, if you let them know ahead of time what the ground rules are, it's a lot easier for people to participate in a way that works. The other thing I recommend is just paying close attention to the introverts in the room. And if you see them tilt their head, you know they're thinking something. And you can just ask and say, you look like you have thought. Do you want to share it? And they may or may not be ready to, but at least they've recognized that you recognized it, and then they're more likely to come up to you after the meeting to share what they were thinking.
Yeah, I love that. And when it comes to body language and nonverbal cues, we tend to be very good at reading them in others, and we can also use them ourselves. Right, so that is a great way that an introvert can. Oh, I don't really want to raise my hand. I'm not quite ready to speak up. But if you, I think when you give off some kind of nonverbal cue like that, in some ways it could be your way of raising your hand. And if you happen to be lucky enough to have a meeting facilitator who recognizes that, then it'll give you that space to speak up.
What's funny is I actually do raise my hand in meetings with a bunch of adults. They're like, you don't need to raise your hand. I'm like, but I want to say the next thing, and I wanted to wait till you're ready.
So, I do the same thing. I blame it on the fact that I'm a rule follower, which is also a typical introvert characteristic. So yeah, I don't want to interrupt, and I like that there's an order to things, and so I like to do it that way.
Yeah, and one thing about networking, going back to that, is I find structure is really, really helpful. Just going into a chamber event where it's just open is stressful. Going to a structured meeting where it's scheduled who's going to talk and when, and what you're supposed to talk about, I find that a lot easier, and I think for most introverts that's the case.
Yeah, the structure, it helps me. Having the agenda ahead of time also helps you to feel more comfortable because of that structure, right? It's less spontaneity required. I love a good Excel matrix for when I'm doing a project plan or creating a plan for a client, and yeah, that works for me. Some people are a lot more spontaneous and free flowing, and that's the beauty of it, right? The first time I had a Myers-Briggs type indicator assessment done when I was working for a nonprofit organization. It was about 15 years ago. And that was actually a turning point for me, the first time that I really recognized that I was an introvert, that I got my 4 letters in Myers-Briggs. And for anyone who's not familiar with it, it's the world's most widely used personality assessment, and it gives you it identifies your preferences in a few different areas, one of which is whether you're introverted or extroverted, which speaks to how you get energy from the world. And so I got my Myers-Briggs, and I'm an ISTJ.
Thank you.
Introverted, sensing, thinking, judging. You are as well?
I'm an INTP.
Okay. And so what I learned from all that is we did some exercises with it on a staff I was a part of, and we got to learn about other people's profiles. And I looked at I was ISTJ, the opposite of that is ENFP. And I learned a few of my colleagues were ENFP, and I realized now I know why you drive me crazy. Right, because we tackle things from a completely different perspective. But what I also learned, this workshop we had was facilitated by a leadership coach, which I think probably was one of the seeds that led me on my path, was that I like to say the beauty's in the alphabet soup. So you want to have a team that has a mix of letters, because if you're all ISTJs or you're all ENFPs, you're going to be missing out on gifts, perspectives, approaches that other people have that are going to add to the richness and value of what you're doing.
Takes all kinds.
It does, and I became a leadership junkie. So I actually got certified to be a Myers-Briggs type indicator practitioner a couple years ago, and so I love working with people to do their reports and talk about what does this mean for your leadership? How can you tap into all these gifts to be the best version of yourself at work?
That is wonderful. I previously had a guest, Michael Scovia, who is a principal instructor for the Myers-Briggs company. And I'll put the notes to which episode it is. But if anyone's interested in learning more about what it means to be an INTP or ENFP or any of those, then that would be a good starter resource. I was lucky enough to have taken a Myers-Briggs workshop when I was in high school. And it completely flipped things on its head for me, because it really felt like people were pretending to be a certain way, because they're just so different, and it seemed absurd that they would act that way. And then when you go through that workshop, you're like, that's really just how they see and perceive the world. It altered my world. It was fantastic.
Isn't it? And if you've ever done it, right, you get this report about yourself, and the legit way of doing it is you meet with a practitioner, with a coach, and they don't tell you your letters right away, but they walk you through what does each letter mean, and you get to decide. You say, based on what you told me, I think I'm an I think I'm an introvert, and it might be that the report showed that you're an extrovert, but if you think after learning about it that I is a better fit for you, that's what you are. Mm-hmm. Which I find really interesting. And I'll say one more thing about it. When you get your report, if you do feel like those letters are the right fit for you, it really describes the combination of your letters. It's not just the individual letters tacked onto each other, right? So the sum of the parts is greater, or the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, right? When I read what does it mean to be an ISTJ, it was like a window to my soul. Mm-hmm. I could not believe how well it described me as a human. So it's a cool thing to do.
When I wrote a book about growing up as the youngest of 10 kids, I was struggling with the introduction of how to introduce all the siblings. And eventually I realized that at a family reunion, I'd had everyone do a Myers-Briggs. So I knew everyone's profile, and I put that in there with one brief sentence about what that means, one brief sentence about the person, and then a true historical person with that same profile, and one like TV or movie character. And for some of the people, like I saw mine, I'm like, fantastic. Those are two of my favorite people, Isaac Newton and Neo from The Matrix. Yes. And then I looked at people for some of my siblings. I'm like, ooh, I don't know if they're going to like that. But when I told them the person, they're like, yes. It really was amazing how much they identified with people who were their same type.
I love it. That's terrific.
Stacey, we're going to have to start wrapping up due to time. Can you share with us where people can find out more about you and or connect?
Yes, please. So please come visit me at ifactorleadership.com. Just the letter, factorleadership.com. And I have a bunch of free resources there. When you first get there, you'll see you can download a free guide. I have daily productivity hacks for introverts, which is how introverts can get more done each day with less stress. They can find me there. I'm also on LinkedIn. You can find me, iFactorLeadership. And if you go back to my website, you'll see different ways to work with me. I work as a coach, and I also offer some on-demand learning that folks, which I think is really well aligned with introverts, who can kind of learn at their own pace and rewatch videos and read through the materials. So it's a fun learning module there called the Introverts Leadership Formula, and I invite you to check it out.
Love it, and I will put a link to that in the show notes. As we wind down, I'm going to ask you my 3 questions. What is a place you have traveled to and loved, and some place that you have not yet been but want to go?
A place I've traveled to and loved is Israel. I've been there a few times. First when I was a teenager, and then again more recently. It's a wonderful place to go. Nice. One place I haven't gone but is really high on my bucket list is Alaska.
Ooh.
I would love to do that. I'm trying to convince my husband.
Wonderful. And question number 2 is, who do you think is a great communicator, whether a historical person or someone just in your personal life?
Yeah, so really the first person who came to mind is a former manager of mine. Her name is Kamala Allen, and she was a wonderful manager on so many levels, but what made her an excellent communicator is she was so good at seeing me for who I was, and making sure that when we engaged formally or informally, that she was communicating to me that she was there to support me. She communicated that she saw the best in me, that she also saw the not so best in me and was there to support me, right? And every way she communicated, whether it was verbally, in writing, or non-verbally, she communicated that she saw me for who I was. She didn't expect me to be someone I wasn't, and she was there to support me. And it was the most meaningful and impactful managerial experience I've ever had.
That sounds like a great one. I wish everybody had more of those.
Everyone should have a Kamala Allen.
Yes. And then the final question is, what is one piece of communication advice we can all benefit from?
Don't be a faker. Lean into who you are. Be your authentic self. I know that's, maybe that's an overused phrase, but really lean into the best of who you are. Recognize who you are when you're at your best, what your gifts are, and use those. Whether you're more comfortable and more effective and more powerful in writing an email versus speaking up in a meeting, do that. Whether it's shorter emails or one long email, whether it's you want to meet with someone in person versus hiding behind a screen, whatever works best for you, whatever taps into the best of who you are as a communicator, go that route, because that's how you're going to be the most impactful and successful and feel fulfilled by the communication engagement.
Play to your strengths. I love it.
That's right.
Stacey, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure, Jeremy. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for listening to Neuroconversant Leadership. If you found this beneficial, can you do me one small favor? It'll be quick, I promise. Can you go and give this podcast a review on Apple or Spotify or wherever it is that you listen before doing anything else? Unless you're driving. If you're driving, then I need you to keep driving. And then when you're done and parked, then go ahead and give me a review. Hopefully 5 stars, but whatever you are comfortable honestly giving. Thank you and have a great day.